Imagine standing in a room filled with the city's most powerful people, champagne glasses clinking, diamonds catching the light, every eye watching every move, and the one person who promised to protect your heart leans in close, just to break it in front of them all. He smirked as he whispered, "You'll never be anything without me." That night, in that glittering ballroom, something inside me snapped, and before sunrise, the man who once humiliated me would be the one on his knees, begging for my help. But before we dive into how I turned the tables so completely, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the wild twists and stories like this one. Now, let's rewind to how it all began. I can still feel the weight of that night clinging to me, the silk of my dress brushing against my skin, the faint scent of roses and champagne in the air, the low hum of laughter echoing through the ballroom. Everything about that evening was supposed to be perfect. It was our night. A celebration of friendship, success, and love. The kind of night you imagine when you're young and dreaming of the life you'll have one day. And for a while, it was exactly that. The lights inside the Belvedere Hotel ballroom were warm and golden, bouncing off the chandeliers like glittering stars. I remember standing at the top of the marble staircase, my hand resting lightly on the polished banister, taking it all in. The men in sharp tuxedos, the women in gowns that shimmered as they moved, the clinking of glasses, the polite kisses on cheeks. It was elegance wrapped in decadence. And beside me, as always, was Daniel, my husband, my partner, my supposed best friend. He looked the part of the perfect man, tall, commanding, devastatingly handsome, in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He had that easy charm people loved, that magnetic smile that could make waiters rush and CEOs lean in closer. And I, the woman on his arm, was meant to be the polished accessory that completed the picture. But beneath the gloss and the compliments, beneath the way his hand rested so gently on the small of my back, there was something else. A tension, a flicker of something I couldn't name. "Smile," he murmured, as we started down the staircase. "Everyone's watching." I did, of course I did, because that's what I'd always done. Smile, support, shine, but never too bright. We made our way into the crowd, weaving through clusters of laughter and conversation. I knew most of the people there, colleagues, friends, investors, people Daniel was desperate to impress. It was one of those nights where reputations were polished and futures were decided over cocktails. At first, everything seemed normal. We mingled, we laughed, we played the part of the perfect couple. But somewhere between the second glass of champagne and the fifth handshake, something shifted. It started small, a passing comment Daniel made to one of his partners, a joke at my expense, something about how I couldn't cook to save my life. Everyone laughed, including me. It was harmless, or so I told myself. Then there was another, and another, about how I spent too much time on silly hobbies, how I wouldn't understand the conversation, but bless her heart, she tries. The laughter around us grew louder. Mine grew quieter, and then, the moment. The one that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. We were standing near the bar, surrounded by some of the most influential people in Daniel's world, his mentor, his business partners, their wives, when he leaned in close. His breath was warm against my ear, his hand still resting gently on my waist, the way it always did. But the words he whispered were knives. "You'll never be anything without me." Just like that. Quiet, cold, cruel, and perfectly timed so no one else could hear. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room around me blurred, the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded into a dull, distant hum. I wanted to say something, to scream, to throw my drink in his face, but instead, I smiled. It wasn't a fake smile either. It was calm, measured, dangerous, because in that moment, something shifted inside me. The humiliation I felt burned hot, then cold, then into something sharper, something stronger. I turned to face him, still smiling, still playing the role everyone expected me to play, and in a voice as smooth as the champagne in my hand, I whispered back, "Watch me." He laughed, a low, patronizing sound that made my stomach twist. He thought it was over. He thought I'd swallowed my pride, like I always did. But that night, under the golden lights and the watchful eyes of everyone who mattered to him, I made a silent promise to myself. This would be the last time he ever humiliated me. And by the time I was done, he'd be the one begging, not for forgiveness, but for me. The ride home that night felt longer than it ever had before. The city lights bled into streaks of gold and red against the tinted windows, and Daniel sat beside me in silence, one hand draped casually over the steering wheel, the other scrolling through his phone as if the world hadn't shifted. As if he hadn't just taken a blade to my dignity and twisted it slowly in front of a room full of people. I stared out the window, my reflection faint against the glass, the soft waves of my hair still in place, my lipstick still perfect, the crimson silk of my gown still draped flawlessly around me. I looked composed, immaculate, untouched, but beneath that calm surface, my thoughts were anything but. He thinks I'm nothing without him. He thinks my worth begins and ends with his approval. The words replayed over and over, sharp and poisonous, but with each repetition, they lost some of their power, and in their place, something new began to form, something colder, smarter. I didn't speak, not once during that ride. I wanted him to sit with the silence, to mistake it for surrender, because that was what Daniel was used to, me smoothing things over, me pretending everything was fine. He fed on that silence. It made him feel bigger, stronger, untouchable. Let him feel that a little longer. We pulled into the driveway of our house, a sleek glass and stone monument to Daniel's ego, and the heavy gate slid shut behind us with a metallic hiss. The house loomed ahead, bathed in warm light, the kind of place people envied when they drove by. For years I had too. Now it just looked hollow. As we stepped inside, Daniel loosened his tie and exhaled, like the night had been a smashing success. "Well," he said, tossing his phone onto the marble counter, "that went well." I set my clutch down and slipped off my heels one by one, my movements slow and deliberate. "It did," I replied softly. "Everyone seemed very impressed with you." He didn't notice the edge in my voice. He rarely did. "Of course they were," he said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "They always are." I leaned against the doorway and watched him for a moment. The arrogance, the certainty, the way he carried himself like a man who believed he'd already won the game before it even started. "Do you really believe that?" I asked. He glanced up, surprised by the question. "Believe what?" "That I'll never be anything without you." The faintest flicker of a smile tugged at his lips. "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "You did." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and took a sip. "I was drunk. It was a joke. Don't take it so personally." "A joke." That's what he always called it when he wanted to make me feel small. "A joke." I crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, measured. "I want you to know something, Daniel." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what's that?" "I heard you," I said. "Every word. And you're right. Maybe I haven't shown the world what I'm capable of. Maybe I've spent too long standing quietly beside you." I paused a breath away from him, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough for him to see that my eyes weren't angry, they were focused, calm, dangerous. "But I will," I whispered, "soon. And when I do, I promise you this, you'll never make a joke like that again." For the first time all night, Daniel's smile faltered. It was brief, barely a flicker, but I saw it, the smallest crack in his armor, and that was enough. "Good night," I said simply, and turned away before he could respond. I barely slept that night. My mind was a storm, 1,000 plans forming, colliding, sharpening. I thought about every sacrifice I had made for him, every opportunity I had passed up, every time I had dimmed myself so he could shine. And I thought about how easily he had dismissed me, as though I were just a shadow he could step over. No more. If Daniel wanted to believe I was nothing without him, I would let him. I would let him underestimate me, dismiss me, write me off. And while he was busy basking in his own arrogance, I would build something, quietly, carefully, that he could never touch. I would build me. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows as Daniel flipped through the news on his tablet, humming to himself like a man with nothing to fear. I made coffee in silence, my mind already miles ahead of him. It started with small things, a few discreet calls, emails sent from an account he didn't know I had, meetings scheduled under the guise of book club or volunteering. I had contacts more than he realized, people I'd met at his events, partners' wives and colleagues' sisters, women who had whispered their own stories over glasses of wine, women who had felt just as small and disposable once. They remembered me, and they were willing to listen. I started learning about opportunities, about investments, about gaps in Daniel's business model that he was too arrogant to notice. Every scrap of information was a thread, and I wove them together slowly, patiently, into a plan. I didn't know exactly how long it would take. weeks, months, maybe longer, but I wasn't in a rush. Power moves, the real ones, are never rushed. And all the while, Daniel remained blissfully unaware. He still made his little jokes at dinner parties, still talked over me when guests visited, still kissed me on the cheek like a man patting a loyal pet. He had no idea that every time he underestimated me, he handed me another weapon, and I took them, all of them, because one day soon, I would use every single one. And when I did, Daniel wouldn't just regret those 7 words, he would choke on them. I wish I could tell you that after those venomous words, you'll never be anything without me. I cried in the bathroom, mascara running down my cheeks, broken and defeated. But no, that's the woman I used to be. And that night, that version of me was already dead. I walked out of that restroom like I was stepping onto a runway. Every insecurity I'd ever nursed, every tiny voice that had ever whispered, maybe he's right, I silenced them all with the sharp click of my heels. If he wanted a show, I was about to give him a masterpiece. The ballroom glittered under chandeliers, laughter and champagne bubbling around me, but my eyes scanned only one face, his. Adrian, my husband, standing at the center of a small crowd, playing the charming businessman he always was, holding court as if nothing had happened. And for a split second, I almost laughed. He truly believed I would retreat quietly, shrink into the background while he basked in the glow. Not tonight. Darling, I said as I approached, voice smooth as silk and just loud enough for the group around him to hear. I hope you weren't too bored without me. He glanced at me, that familiar patronizing smile tugging at his lips, the same smile he always wore when he thought he was 3 steps ahead. Not at all, he murmured. We were just talking about the new tech initiative at the firm. A little too complex for cocktail chatter, I'm afraid. I tilted my head, pretending to ponder. Complex? Oh, you mean the one based on predictive analytics and behavior modeling? The one that's already outdated because Sonova launched a similar prototype last quarter? The group went quiet. His smile faltered. Barely, but enough. And that was the first small crack in his armor. It was a deliberate choice. I wasn't going to humiliate him outright. That would make me petty. Instead, I was going to elevate myself in such a way that every single person here would begin to wonder if he was the one holding me back. A tall man beside Adrian, a board member if I remembered correctly, leaned forward, intrigued. I didn't realize you were following the analytics market so closely. Oh, I said with a light shrug, I've been consulting in that field for months. Data is only as powerful as the story you tell with it, which is why most companies miss the real opportunity. Adrian's jaw tightened. Since when are you consulting? Since I stopped asking for your permission, I replied sweetly. It was a surgical strike, not loud, not dramatic, but deadly precise. The conversation shifted immediately. Questions were thrown my way, interest sparked, people started listening to me, and slowly, the invisible center of gravity in that circle shifted from him to me. I could see it in his eyes, confusion, then annoyance, then the faintest flicker of panic. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't need him as a mouthpiece, the one who commanded a room rather than decorating it. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted him. All I'd done was exist loudly in a space he thought belonged solely to him. Fascinating, said the board member finally. You know, we're always looking for strategic consultants with that kind of perspective. Perhaps we should talk more, Ms. Lena, I said, smiling directly at Adrian as I extended my hand. Just Lena. And there it was, the first visible crack in his carefully constructed world. The moment he realized this wasn't going to be a night he controlled. I didn't need revenge served cold. I wanted it delivered in champagne flutes, disguised as charm and intellect, wrapped in silk and a knowing smile. And as I caught his gaze from across the room, his eyes dark with something between anger and disbelief, I knew the night was only just beginning. Because this was just Act 1. And by the time the final toast was raised, the man who once whispered that I was nothing without him would be choking on those very words. You know that strange electric moment when the energy in a room subtly changes, when conversations slow, heads turn, and suddenly, people who barely noticed you an hour ago are now gravitating toward your orbit. That was what started happening about 30 minutes after my little consulting bombshell. I had become the gravitational center. Everywhere I moved, people followed. CEOs, investors, board members, even their spouses, curious about the woman Adrian had so confidently belittled earlier. They asked questions, listened intently, laughed at my stories, and nodded thoughtfully at my insights. And Adrian, He tried to insert himself back into the spotlight, cracking jokes, making business boasts, even dropping names, but it was like watching someone try to stop the tide with their hands. Every attempt he made felt forced, almost desperate. At one point, I glanced across the room and caught him watching me from the bar, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, eyes sharp with something I hadn't seen before. Was it jealousy? Fear? Maybe both. It was delicious. But this wasn't about humiliating him. Not yet. This was about power. Quiet, undeniable, earned power. And I wasn't done. When the gala host announced that the evening's keynote speaker had been delayed, I saw my opening. Would anyone like to share a few thoughts while we wait? The host asked the crowd, smiling politely. Before Adrian could even breathe in to volunteer, because of course he was going to, I stepped forward. I'd love to, I said, my voice clear and calm. The room hushed. It wasn't common for a guest to take the stage impromptu, and certainly not the wife of the man who was usually the loudest voice in every room. But I wasn't the wife anymore. I was a woman with something to say. I walked up to that podium like I was born for it. My heart wasn't racing. My hands didn't shake. In fact, I felt lighter than I had in years. Good evening, I began, letting my gaze sweep over the elegantly dressed faces. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but I suppose the most important words we say are often the ones we never planned. A few people smiled. A few leaned forward. Adrian, though, his lips parted slightly in disbelief. He hadn't seen this coming. I've spent many years in rooms like this, I continued, rooms full of brilliant, driven people who build companies, lead teams, change industries, and for a long time I believed my only place in these rooms was beside someone else, not as someone myself. Silence. Total silence. But here's what I've learned. The greatest mistake we make is confusing support with invisibility. And the most dangerous lie we're ever told, sometimes by others, sometimes by ourselves, is that we're not capable of standing alone. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And every word landed like a slow, deliberate strike. I didn't need to name him. Every single person there knew exactly who I was talking about. When I stepped down from that stage, people didn't just clap, they rose to their feet, a standing ovation, for me. I turned toward Adrian, and for the first time all night, he couldn't meet my eyes. The man who once stood taller than anyone in the room was now shrinking in my shadow, and I hadn't even done anything cruel. I'd simply spoken the truth. Brilliant, the board member from earlier said, shaking my hand again. Truly inspiring. Thank you, I replied, smiling. And then quietly, just loud enough for Adrian to hear. Seems I might be something without you after all. It was a small line. A soft, subtle dagger slipped neatly between the ribs of his pride. And as he stared at me, jaw tight, eyes unreadable, I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. This wasn't the evening he'd imagined. The woman he had dismissed, diminished, underestimated, was now the woman everyone wanted to know, and the night wasn't even close to over. Because my next move, that would make his knees buckle. The air in that ballroom had shifted, and I could feel it clinging to my skin like perfume. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking in Adrian's shadow, he was walking in mine. And the best part? I didn't even have to force it. After my impromptu speech, people began orbiting closer, pulling me into conversations Adrian thought would always belong to him. CEOs leaned in to hear my perspective on new markets. Their wives and daughters asked for advice about balance and independence. The host himself complimented me on saving the evening with authenticity. Meanwhile, Adrian floated on the edges of every group like a ghost, trying to insert himself with a loud laugh or a story no one cared to finish. I'd spent years watching him dominate every room we entered, but now, every polite smile and half-hearted nod told me the truth. His reign was slipping. I didn't have to tear him down. He was unraveling all by himself. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A tall man with silver hair and eyes sharp enough to slice through steel approached me. I knew who he was instantly. Charles Harrington, chairman of one of the most powerful investment firms in the city. The kind of man whose name made stock prices jump. "Mrs. Sinclair, isn't it?" he said, extending his hand. "Yes," I smiled, shaking it firmly. "Though Elena works just fine." "I was struck by your words tonight," he said. "You have a remarkable presence. Tell me, have you ever considered consulting for leadership boards? A woman with your perspective would be refreshing." I didn't let my jaw drop, though it wanted to. Instead, I gave him the kind of poised smile I'd practiced in mirrors for years. "I have, actually," I said smoothly, "but I'm very selective about who I work with." He chuckled. "Of course, As you should be. Still, I'd like to schedule a meeting. Soon. And just like that, opportunity. The kind Adrian had dangled over me for years, always implying I wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't him. And here it was, handed to me directly by one of the most powerful men in the room. I could feel Adrian's stare boring into me from across the ballroom. He knew exactly what was happening, and he hated it. He waited until Harrington walked away before storming over. "What the hell was that?" he hissed under his breath, trying to keep his smile plastered on for the nearby guests. I tilted my head. A conversation? With Charles Harrington? His jaw clenched. "Elena, do you have any idea what kind of circles you're playing in? You can't." But I cut him off with a soft laugh, sipping my champagne like his outrage amused me. "Funny, Adrian. Didn't you just tell me tonight that I'd never be anything without you? Yet Harrington didn't seem to notice you at all." His nostrils flared, but he couldn't argue because he knew it was true. That was when the universe, in its wickedly perfect timing, handed me the dagger I needed. The host announced that dinner would be served. Guests began drifting toward the long tables set beneath glittering chandeliers. Name cards waited at each seat. I watched Adrian stride toward the head table, expecting his usual place of honor, only to find his card placed 2 rows back. His face blanched. He turned and saw me being guided by the host himself to a seat right at the center, directly beside Harrington. It wasn't my doing, at least not yet. But fate had decided to join the game, and I wasn't about to waste the chance. As I sat down, I leaned toward Harrington with a smile, my voice low but firm. "You'll have to forgive my husband," I said. "He's still learning the difference between having a seat at the table and earning it." Harrington chuckled knowingly. Adrian froze 3 rows away, his fork clattering against his plate. And in that single moment, everyone in that glittering ballroom saw it, the unspoken truth, that the power had shifted. The king had been dethroned, and I hadn't even touched the crown yet. I always imagined that if I ever gained the upper hand over Adrian, he'd explode, a tantrum, a public scene, maybe even a dramatic walkout. But that's not how men like him break. They don't shatter in one blow. They crack, silently, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the whole facade begins to splinter. And tonight, I saw the first fracture. Dinner was exquisite. 5 courses of delicate flavors and conversations that swirled with opportunity. From my seat beside Charles Harrington, I navigated discussions about emerging markets, new tech ventures, and the ethics of power with ease. And the more I spoke, the more they listened. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, admiration, curiosity, even envy. But one gaze burned hotter than the rest, Adrian's. He sat 3 rows away, surrounded by people he used to command, nodding at conversations that barely included him. Every so often, his eyes would flicker toward me, frustration hiding behind a forced smile, his fork stabbing too sharply into his food. By the time dessert arrived, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood, glass of wine in hand, tapping the side with a spoon to get everyone's attention. A hush fell over the room. "If I could have a moment," he announced, his voice louder than it needed to be. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of my wife tonight." Ah, there it was, the performance. "She's always been supportive," he continued, smiling too hard. But hearing her speak like that, inspiring. And of course, none of it would have been possible without the opportunities we've shared over the years. Every success is a team effort, after all. The room chuckled politely, but I could hear the subtext. Don't forget who made her. Don't forget who brought her here. I let the silence stretch when he sat down again. Then I rose, slowly, deliberately, and tapped my own glass. "I'm so touched by my husband's words," I said, voice smooth as silk. "He's absolutely right. Success is a team effort, and I suppose tonight is proof of what happens when one part of the team stops holding the other back." The laughter this time wasn't polite. It was sharp, real, and it sliced right through him. The rest of the night, he didn't speak. Not when Harrington asked for my card. Not when the mayor's wife insisted I join her charity board. Not even when the event photographer asked for a picture, just of me, because as he put it, "You're the face everyone will want in tomorrow's features." But I knew silence was never the end with Adrian. No, silence was his warning sign, the coil before the strike, and I was right, because the moment we stepped into the car, his mask cracked. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, the door barely shut. Humiliating me, in front of everyone. I looked out the window, smiling faintly at the city lights streaking past. "I didn't humiliate you, Adrian. I simply stopped shrinking to make you feel tall." he scoffed, raking a hand through his hair. "This little show you're putting on, it's cute, but we both know who actually built this life." I turned to him then, meeting his glare with a calm that unsettled him more than rage ever could. "Maybe. But if you built it, why does it all feel like it's slipping through your fingers?" He didn't have an answer, just clenched fists and shallow breaths. That night, I lay awake beside him in bed, not because I was afraid, but because I was planning. I knew men like Adrian didn't just accept losing control, they fought back, and his ego wouldn't allow this shift to go unanswered. But here's the thing about egos, they're predictable. They make sloppy decisions, and if you're patient enough, they'll hand you the weapon you need to destroy them. I didn't know what his next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it would be his downfall. They always make the first mistake when they panic. And Adrian, for all his bravado, for all the years he'd believed himself untouchable, was now a man drowning quietly beneath the surface. And drowning men, they thrash. 3 days passed after the gala. 3 long, unnervingly quiet days. He barely spoke over breakfast, barely looked at me at night. If I asked how work was, I got a clipped fine. If I mentioned my new contacts from the event, he changed the subject. I knew that silence, it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Adrian wasn't retreating, he was reloading. And then, on the 4th morning, I found out how. I was pouring coffee when he strolled into the kitchen in a navy suit I hadn't seen him wear in months, one of his power suits. It meant he was planning something. "Big meeting?" I asked lightly, handing him his cup. He gave me that charming, calculated smile, the one that used to make me melt before I learned what it really meant. "Actually, yes, I'm meeting with some board members about restructuring a few departments." "Departments?" I tilted my head. "Which ones?" He shrugged. "Oh, the usual. Marketing, development, advisory." I froze for half a second. Advisory. The division that had been courting me since the gala, the one I was considering consulting for. Ah, there it was. His move. By noon, the whispers had already reached me. Adrian had raised concerns about the firm's new push to hire external consultants, especially ones with potential conflicts of interest. And by conflicts of interest, he meant me. It was a clever tactic, I'll give him that. He couldn't stop me from being approached, but he could poison the well before I arrived. He could plant enough doubt to make me seem like a liability. For a man drowning, it was a desperate but impressive kick. Unfortunately for him, I had been playing a different game. That afternoon, I put on my most understated navy sheath dress, slicked my hair into a low bun, and walked into the very office where he was spinning his narrative. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw me. "Mrs. Sinclair." "Elena," I corrected gently. "I have a meeting with Charles Harrington," she stammered. "I don't think he's expecting me," I lied smoothly. And it worked. Within minutes, I was stepping into a mahogany-paneled conference room. Adrian was there, mid-sentence, leaning against the table as a half-dozen executives listened. His face paled when he saw me. "Ah," Harrington said, rising with a smile, "the woman of the hour." "Mr. Harrington," I greeted warmly, shaking his hand before turning to the room. "I heard there were concerns about external consultants. I thought I'd come answer them directly." The next 15 minutes were a masterclass in quiet power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply spoke. About conflict of interest policies, about advisory integrity, about how a consultant from outside the company, even one married to an executive, could actually reduce bias, not increase it. Every word was calm, logical, measured. Every answer dismantled the seeds Adrian had tried to plant, and when I finished, there was a long, heavy pause. Finally, Harrington leaned back in his chair, a slow smile forming. "I think that settles it. Elena, we'd be lucky to have you." I nodded politely. "I look forward to working with you." I walked out of that boardroom with my head high and my heart pounding. I had turned his trap into my launch pad, and I hadn't needed to raise a single weapon. Adrian followed me into the hallway, his face thunderous. "What the hell was that?" I turned to him, voice quiet and deadly calm. "That was me cleaning up the mess you made. Next time, don't underestimate the woman you once called nothing." For a moment, he just stared at me, lips parted as if words might come. But they didn't. He was learning, painfully, humiliatingly, that I wasn't the same woman he'd built his throne on, and as I walked away, heels clicking against polished marble, I realized something monumental. This wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. This was about becoming untouchable. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop fearing someone. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, almost unsettling. like a storm that's passed, leaving the air too still, too calm. That's what I felt in the days after the boardroom incident. Adrian had tried to block me. I'd walked straight through his blockade. And for the first time, he realized that the weapons he'd always used against me, manipulation, control, intimidation, had lost their power. But I also knew this. A man like Adrian doesn't surrender. He escalates. And his next move would be bigger, more dangerous. I was right. It started with little things. My credit cards were accidentally declined at a boutique I frequented. The car service I used suddenly reported unpaid invoices that he'd handled for years. Even the joint savings account looked suspiciously lighter than usual. Subtle, quiet, but obvious to anyone who knew his playbook. Adrian was cutting off my lifelines, tightening the noose, hoping I'd panic and crawl back under his control. What he didn't know was that I had already anticipated this. For months, long before that humiliating gala, I had been setting aside money in a separate account, under a name he didn't know. Every freelance project, every consulting gig I took on the side, every penny I could quietly reroute had gone there. It wasn't much at first, but it was enough now. Enough to stand on my own 2 feet, enough to not care about his petty financial games. So when I saw the account balance drop again that morning, I didn't flinch. I simply smiled and dialed my lawyer. "It's time," I said. 3 days later, Adrian tried to pull off what he must have believed was his checkmate. He came home earlier than usual, carrying a crisp envelope and wearing that smug little half-smile I used to mistake for charm. "I think we need to talk," he said. "About?" I asked, not looking up from my laptop. He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a formal notice, a request for exclusive financial authority over certain assets and investments, citing mismanagement concerns. In plain English, he was trying to legally strip me of access to everything. It was bold, risky, and completely predictable. I looked up at him and smiled, genuinely smiled. "You really think I'd let you do this?" His smirk faltered. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair. "I mean, I knew this was coming, and I made sure those accounts were transferred 2 weeks ago. Not a single asset is in your reach anymore." His face drained of color. You moved them, secured them, and I also filed for an audit of all your accounts. Just routine, of course. You know how regulators love surprises." The silence that followed was thick and beautiful. That night, the mask finally cracked. "Do you even hear yourself?" he shouted, pacing the living room. "You're trying to destroy me." I watched him quietly. "No, Adrian. I'm just refusing to let you destroy me anymore. Everything you have, everything exists because of me." "Maybe once," I said softly, "but not anymore." He stopped pacing then, just stood there, chest heaving, eyes dark with something ugly, desperation, fear, pride, maybe all three. And then, something in his expression shifted. He straightened, brushed off his suit jacket, and forced a small, cold smile. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen what I can do." I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. He wasn't threatening me anymore. He was warning himself. He was the one losing ground, the one scrambling to stay relevant in a life that had stopped revolving around him. And I wasn't scared. Not even a little, because for the first time in our marriage, I knew exactly who I was. And he had no idea what was coming next. And I would be waiting. There's something unnerving about silence after a war. The days following our confrontation were too still, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for the next explosion. And deep down, I knew Adrian wasn't done. He was licking his wounds, plotting. Men like him didn't walk away after losing power. They clawed back. They schemed. They burned everything before letting someone else win. And he was about to prove that. It started subtly, almost laughably so. A mutual acquaintance accidentally mentioned a rumor about my questionable ethics in a client deal. A week later, a minor tax irregularity from 3 years ago mysteriously resurfaced, flagged by the authorities. And then the worst of it, an anonymous email landed in my inbox with photos of me from a private event, twisted out of context to look like corporate bribery. Adrian was done playing behind the scenes. Now he was trying to ruin me publicly. I stared at the email, lips pressed into a thin line. There it was, his last desperate weapon, reputation. If he couldn't control me financially or emotionally, he'd try to make sure no one else would ever trust me again. And in that moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Because what he didn't realize was that he'd just walked right into the trap I had been setting all along. 3 months earlier, back when the first cracks in our marriage began to show, I'd started keeping receipts. Every shady business call he'd taken, every backroom deal he'd bragged about, every questionable offshore transfer he thought I hadn't noticed. I'd compiled it all. Dates, amounts, witnesses, even recordings. It wasn't blackmail, it was insurance. And now it was time to cash it in. I called a press contact I trusted, the kind of investigative journalist who could smell blood from a mile away. I didn't have to say much, just a few key phrases and a link to a heavily encrypted file. The rest I knew would unfold like wildfire. The explosion came 2 days later. Headlines lit up every major business outlet. Tech mogul under investigation for fraud and market manipulation. Anonymous source leaks evidence of decade-long scheme. CEO's offshore accounts under scrutiny, amidst scandal. The photos Adrian had tried to use against me suddenly looked laughable next to real crimes. Board members distanced themselves. Investors demanded answers. And Adrian, the man who had once strutted through every boardroom like he owned the oxygen, was now dodging cameras and subpoenas. I expected him to lash out. I expected anger, rage, maybe even a public statement. What I didn't expect was the knock on my door at 2 a.m. I opened it to find him standing there, barefoot, disheveled, no suit, no mask, just a broken man clutching a glass of whiskey and a desperate plea in his eyes. "Please," he whispered, "call them off." I blinked, almost laughing. "You think I control the media? You started this," he hissed. "You sent that file. And you started everything else, Adrian," I said quietly. "Every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal. This isn't me ruining you. This is you finally facing consequences." He stepped closer, voice trembling now. "If I go down, I'll take you with me." I smiled, cold, unshaken. "You can't. I made sure of it. Every shred of evidence ties back to you alone. I'm clean." For the first time, Adrian's face truly collapsed. No rage, no arrogance, just fear, pure, helpless fear. You planned this," he murmured. "From the moment you underestimated me," I said. "Yes." He left without another word, stumbling down the hall like a ghost of the man he once was. And as the door closed behind him, I felt something shift inside me, something final. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was freedom. The war was over. And for the first time in years, I was finally free. Free from his control, free from his chaos, free from the version of myself I'd shrunk into just to survive him. And though I knew there were still consequences ahead, investigations, board inquiries, endless questions, I wasn't afraid. Because this time, the story was mine to write. The morning after Adrian's midnight plea felt eerily calm, like the eye of a storm had drifted directly over my life. But I knew better than to trust that silence. The world wasn't done talking. The headlines weren't done screaming. And the empire he had spent his entire adult life building was about to collapse like wet paper. The first domino fell at 8:12 a.m., an emergency board meeting called without Adrian's knowledge. By noon, 3 of his most loyal executives had resigned. By sunset, federal investigators had frozen half his company's accounts, and by the end of the week, he was no longer CEO. It was poetic, really. The man who once told me I was nothing without him was now a pariah, exiled from the very throne he had built, while I, the woman he had mocked and underestimated, was being courted by the same powerful people who had once dismissed me as his accessory. I remember the moment it truly hit me. I was standing on the balcony of my new office, my office overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out before me, golden under the setting sun. My name was now on the glass door. My name was on the contracts. And my calendar was booked with meetings I had chosen, with investors and partners who needed me. Me, not Adrian's wife, not the woman behind the man, just me. And yet, as intoxicating as it was, a part of me still felt tethered to that past, to the years I had spent being silenced, manipulated, diminished. Freedom wasn't just about walking away, it was about reclaiming every part of yourself you'd buried to survive, and I wasn't done digging. 2 weeks later, my lawyer called. His voice was calm, but there was a tension underneath. "There's something you need to see," he said. "Something in Adrian's old accounts. It's unusual." Unusual was an understatement. What he showed me next nearly made my blood run cold. Buried beneath layers of shell companies and offshore accounts was a trust, one I had never known existed, worth nearly $60 million. But it wasn't the money that shocked me. It was the name. My name. Adrian had set it up years ago, quietly, secretly. Every year, he'd funneled money into it, money he had claimed didn't exist, money he had always said we couldn't afford. At first, I thought it was guilt. Maybe he'd known, on some level, that what he'd done to me was unforgivable. But then I found the letter, a draft he had written but never sent. If anything happens to me, this goes to her. She'll hate me by then. I know she will, but she was always the smart one. She was always the one who deserved more. I read it 3 times before the tears finally came. Because for all the cruelty, the lies, the betrayal, part of Adrian had known I was always destined to rise, and some twisted part of him had wanted me to. The night before his sentencing hearing, he called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, or maybe closure, made me pick up. "Congratulations," he rasped, his voice stripped of all arrogance. "You did it." "No," I said softly. "You did this to yourself." He gave a weak laugh. "I thought I could break you, but you were always stronger than I was." There was a long silence. Then, in a voice so small I almost missed it, he added, "Do you hate me?" I closed my eyes. Memories flooded back, the humiliation, the manipulation, the pain, but also the fire, the strength, the version of myself I had become because of it all. "No," I whispered, "I don't hate you. I just don't need you anymore." The next morning, he was sentenced, a quiet, subdued affair. No reporters, no photographers, just a man who had once owned the room, now standing alone before a judge, stripped of everything. As I walked out of the courthouse, the autumn wind caught my hair and lifted it gently around my face. People stopped me for interviews. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted my name, but I didn't stop. I didn't speak. I just walked forward, free, and finally untouchable. And that's the real ending no one talks about. Revenge isn't about watching them fall. It's about rising so high they can't even reach the hem of your dress. And as for me, the woman who once smiled through humiliation at a gala, the woman who was told she'd be nothing, she built an empire of her own, not in spite of him, but beyond him. I used to think that power was the final destination, that if I could just prove him wrong, if I could just rise higher than he ever imagined, the ache inside me would disappear. But as I sat in the corner office of the company that now bore my name, staring at the glittering skyline I'd once only dreamed of, I realized something unsettling. The ache was still there. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was something deeper, a hollow space carved out by years of shrinking myself for someone else's comfort. And even though I'd won, I still hadn't filled it. Because proving him wrong wasn't the same as proving myself right. The invitations started pouring in. TED Talks, women in business panels, global summits. They all wanted to hear the story of the woman who had been humiliated at a gala and turned her pain into power. "Tell us how you did it," they'd say. "Tell us how you rose." But every time I stood on a stage, every time the applause washed over me, I felt the same question echoing at the back of my mind. And now what? It was easy to build an empire out of spite. It was harder to build a life out of peace. One evening I stayed late in the office. The cleaners had already left. The city below was humming softly, and I was surrounded by everything I had ever wanted. And yet, as I stared at the glass walls and designer furniture, it all felt strangely empty. I picked up an old photo from my desk drawer, one I hadn't looked at in years. It was me, 10 years ago, barefoot in a tiny apartment, sketching business ideas on the back of a takeout menu. My eyes in that picture were so bright, so certain. That version of me didn't dream about revenge. She dreamed about creation, about building something beautiful, about leading with vision, not anger. I missed her. And in that quiet, lonely office, I decided it was time to find her again. The next morning, I called a meeting. My board expected another ruthless expansion plan, another acquisition. Instead, I told them I was stepping down as CEO. The room erupted in disbelief. "You can't just walk away," one of them said. "This is yours." "It is," I said calmly, "and I'm choosing what to do with it." I wasn't quitting. I was evolving. I would stay on as chairwoman, but the day-to-day grind, the boardroom battles, those were no longer mine to fight. My mission was bigger now. I wanted to create a foundation, one that helped women rebuild after financial abuse, one that gave them the tools to never have to rely on anyone again. I wanted to fund young female founders with no safety nets, the kind I once was. I wanted to use the power I'd earned not to prove a point, but to change a world. It's strange how life comes full circle. A year later, I found myself standing in a small, sunlit office, not in a skyscraper, but in a community center. Women from all walks of life filled the room. Some were fresh out of shelters, some were rebuilding careers. All of them were starting over. I told them my story, not the headlines, not the drama, but the truth, the humiliation, the fear, the small hard steps back to myself. And as I spoke, I watched something light up in their faces. The same light I'd seen in that old photograph of myself. Hope. And that's when I understood. The woman Adrian had tried to destroy was gone. But in her place was someone stronger, someone softer, someone more whole than she had ever been. The night the foundation launched, I stood alone on my balcony once more, the city spread out beneath me, and for the first time since that terrible gala, I felt completely, utterly, at peace. I no longer needed Adrian's apology. I no longer needed the world's applause. I didn't even need revenge, because I had built something far greater than any empire. I had rebuilt myself. There's a strange peace that comes when you're no longer waiting for anything. Not an apology, not justice, not even recognition, just peace. And as I stood beneath the soft amber lights of the Foundation's one-year gala, surrounded by the laughter of women whose lives had transformed, that's exactly what I felt. Peace. Real, bone-deep peace. The room was alive with stories. One woman had launched a bakery that now supplied cafes across the city. Another had gone back to school to study law. And a third, a soft-spoken mother of two, was preparing to buy her first home. Each one of them had started where I once was, lost, humiliated, underestimated, and each one had risen. I raised my glass as the evening's final toast was announced. It wasn't about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. But as I looked around, I realized that this, right here, was the legacy I had been meant to build all along. The evening was nearly over when one of the volunteers hurried over. "There's someone asking for you," she said. "He's waiting outside." My heart stilled, because I already knew. I stepped out into the cool night air, and there he was, Adrian. I hadn't seen him in over a year. He was thinner now, older. The arrogance that once clung to him like a second skin was gone, replaced by something quieter. Humility, maybe, or just exhaustion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed around us, distant and indifferent. "You look happy," he said at last, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I am," I replied simply. He nodded, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. "I wanted to come sooner. I just didn't know how." "You didn't need to," I said. "We've both moved on." "I haven't," he admitted. "Not really. I think about that night, the gala, every single day, and if I could take it all back, I would." I believed him. For the first time, I truly believed him. But the most surprising part? I didn't need to. There was a time when hearing those words would have been everything, when I thought closure was something he had to give me. But standing there now, I realized I'd already given it to myself. "I forgive you," I said quietly. His eyes flickered with disbelief. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," I said. "It took years. It took rebuilding myself. But yes, I forgive you. Not for you. For me." He exhaled shakily, as if the weight of the past decade had been sitting on his chest and was only now being lifted. "I don't expect anything," he murmured. "I just wanted to say I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry." I nodded. "Thank you. That's enough." He smiled, a small, sad smile, then turned to leave. For a moment, I watched his figure disappear into the city lights, and with it, the last shadow of the life I once lived. When I stepped back inside, the music swelled, glasses clinked, and the women I had come to love and admire called me over. I walked toward them, lighter than I had ever felt, and that's how the story ends. Not with revenge, not with destruction, not even with triumph, but with something far more powerful: peace, purpose, and a future I built with my own hands. I had been humiliated once, broken down to nothing, but that was the night I was reborn, not as someone's wife, not as someone's victim, but as the woman I was always meant to become. They say revenge is sweet, but healing? Healing is honey, slow, deep, and worth every second it takes to make. And as for me, I didn't just survive him, I transcended him. If you're still watching, maybe you've been where I was, made small, silenced, told you were nothing without them, and maybe you're standing at the edge of your own story, wondering if you'll ever rise. I'm here to tell you, you will, not to get revenge, not to prove them wrong, but because you deserve to live a life that isn't built around their shadow. So if this story touched something inside you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because somewhere out there, another woman is about to rise too, and maybe, just maybe, your story will help her find the strength to start.